Hello everybody. All right, so today I've got a short video. Well, I don't know. I'm thinking it's going to be short, but it could turn out to be a bit longer. But basically, there's a few things I want to go through today. So I'm going to go through a few configuration settings for your databases. Then after that, I'm going to walk you through creating some users and creating some tables. And these are users and tables that come from the learning resources for our book. So that's a really simple step. We just basically run a script and it creates 3 sets of tables and 3 sets of users. And these are tables that we'll be using during our assignments, potentially during tests as well. So it'll be good to get these set up. And then after that, I'll probably do a short example of creating tables. And just a quick reminder, of course, the first assignment is due this coming Friday, and that's posted, and there's a Dropbox on D2L. Okay, so let's get started here. So I've got my database, and I'll just close this connection. All right. So when we go to connect, hopefully you guys have your databases working. Everything's working properly. But there can be some issues. So what I want to show you today is right now you'll notice for the host name for my database, I'm using an IP address, a private IP address. Now that IP happens to be the IP address on my private home network. So if I go IP config, you'll notice that I have an IP4 address of 192.168.2.23. So essentially, that is what my database is able to connect to, okay? So right now, it works because I have internet connection. I'm connected to the network. So if I were to go and hit connect, okay, there it goes, right? It's gonna connect. I can open this up and I can see all of my database properties are available. So I'll go ahead now and I'll disconnect. And let's say I went into my network settings and I disabled my Ethernet. Okay? So now I'm not connected. I mean, in my case, I'm using just a desktop PC, but you guys probably have laptops potentially. So you may take it somewhere and not have a connection. So now if I were to go to my connection properties, if I'm trying to connect using that IP, as you can guess, it's not going to work, okay? So this might be an error that you guys have come across. So if you want it to work without being connected on a network, then you need to set up a Loopback Adapter, which is a pretty simple process. So really all you need to do that is you can just Google it. And so basically add and configure Microsoft Loopback Adapter. And of course, it's a problem if you don't have internet, right? Okay, so let's turn that back on. Okay, so we're gonna see a bunch of different links here of how to do this. So I'm just gonna walk through the steps that I would use, and you guys can go ahead and find this stuff, no problem. I'm sure you're on your own as well. Okay, so let's just go through these steps now of what you would do. So just looking here at my network connections. You can see that I just have an Ethernet connection and I have a couple VPN connections here as well. So for my Ethernet connection, if I disable that, then of course I cannot connect to my database. So what we're going to do is we're going to add the Loopback Adapter, which will then allow me to connect even when I'm not connected to the internet. So to do that, I'm just going to go in and open up Device Manager. Okay, and I'm gonna go Action and Add Legacy Hardware, Next, and then I'm gonna install this from a list. And I'm gonna go Network Adapters and Microsoft, and I want the Microsoft Loopback Adapter, so I'm gonna go Next. It's now going to set this up. And now when I go to my list of network connections, I have this Loopback Adapter. So I just have to go in and basically assign an IP address. So I'm gonna go into my TCP connection for IP version 4, and I'm gonna go to Properties and use the following IP address. I'm just gonna assign a private address of 10.10.10.10, and then 255.0 for the subnet mask. And then I can click OK. And there we go. So now let's do this test again. Now I'm going to disable my network connection, so I'm not connected to the internet. And of course, when I try to connect, I'm going to get an error, but now I should have the option of connecting to my local host. And there we go. So now I'm connected. So if you guys were having that problem where you weren't on a network, then of course you have to go and set up the Loopback adapter. All right, so let's enable this. Okay, so the next step I'm going to show you guys is that we have some additional scripts that we want to use to set up our database with. And these are posted on D2L. All right, so on D2L, I'm going to go to Content, and then under Software, I have these scripts in a zipped folder, db_setup12c. So I'm going to download this and extract it. Okay, so inside here, we basically have a bunch of SQL files, and we have a Windows batch file as well. There's not a whole lot we need to do, but let's look at this batch file. So in the batch file, it is going to connect to the database. So it's going to make a call SQL plus, and then it's going to log in as system as the user and then system as the password. Now, I've set up my password as system all lowercase, okay? Whatever you chose for your password, you're going to have to potentially edit this file to use your own password. And I think this is the only place where there is a password. Let's just take a quick look at these other scripts here. So this one, okay, that's fine. Create tables. Yeah. So yeah, these should be fine. Okay. All right, so let's go through the actual steps we would use to run this. So all I need to do is I'm gonna open up a command prompt in this folder. And the command I need, I'm just gonna run this setup database.bat. So I'm running the batch file. And this is gonna go through, it's gonna create 3 new users. It's going to then assign permissions to the users, and it's going to create a series of tables for each of these users. Okay, there we go. Now, I've run this before, so the first command it does is it drops the previous users and drops the tables and recreates them. So you might see a few errors when you run this for the first time. Okay, so that's good. So we have that all set up. So now, if I were to go to my database, and I've already logged in. So one of the things you can do is I can go and open up here, other users, and these are the 3 users that I've created. I've created CAP, CEX, and COM. Now right now in SQL Developer, I can actually switch between these different users. So I can go connect, right? And I'll run this, and there we go. I've now connected to this other user account. Okay, so one of the nice things about having these three users is we can kind of treat each of these users as a separate sort of database. And you'll notice here that we have a bunch of tables in AP, and I should probably look up what AP stands for. But basically we have another set in EX, and we have another set in OM, okay? So these are basically just different sort of setups, table setups for slightly different businesses, essentially. So it's a good way to organize our database. If we just put all of the tables into the default user, then it'd be kind of a mess trying to find what table we're looking for. So for example, when I go back to just when we first connect, we have all these tables here. But it's much easier for us to just work with the tables within each of these users. So to show you how we can do that, if I were to use, we talked a little bit about the data dictionary last class. If I were to do a query, so select table name from user tables, if I run this, okay, I'm gonna get all of these different tables, right? But if I want to just work with the tables that are inside the AP user, I can say connect. And when I run this now, I'm going to notice the button I'm going to click is going to run the entire script. And when it does that, I just see the tables that I want to focus on with the AP user. So when we start doing more like larger assignments, I'll probably be giving you instructions to say, do this set, create this set of queries inside the AP user. So for doing that, you'll want to connect to the AP user, and then you'll want to write out all of your basically your queries as you go. And that should simplify your workflow quite a bit. If you make a mistake or you need to go look something up, you can go right into this user here. You don't have to go back and look through a huge number of tables, which is kind of overwhelming, I think. All right. So we've got through the first two things, and really the last thing I want to do is just maybe a quick example that we can do for creating tables. So we'll use the AP user again. And what we can do is we'll create a few simple tables, just a couple simple tables inside the AP user. And we can also use the command to drop the table before we create it. That way we can make changes to it and then practice recreating the table. So I'm just going to chapter 10 here in the textbook because that's where we have the information about the how to create tables. So the table we'll create, let's create a table. There's one listed here. This is on page 315 in the textbook, and this is the vendor table. So we can just write a couple quick scripts here. So I will say create table vendors. Okay, and it's going to be a really simple table. So vendors is going to have a vendor ID. Oops. And that is going to be of type number. And vendor is also going to have a vendor name. And that is going to have a type of var char with 50 character maximum. Okay, and that's our entire table. So if I were to run this, I should get a new table in the AP user. Okay, so that didn't work too well because there already is a vendors table there. So let's just say at vendors, okay, let's just do this. instead of using the AP user, let's use the OM user. Okay, there we go. And if I refresh the tables, I now have a table vendors right here. Okay, so it's that easy to create a table. Now I can also drop table vendors, and I should be able to run this, and that did not work. It's because I don't have a semicolon probably. Okay, there we go. So it drops the table, recreates it. So one thing you'll notice about the vendors table is that I'm not specifying any constraints or default values or anything like that. I'm just declaring the actual structure of the columns, and that's it. So obviously that's missing. We need to be, at the very least saying what the primary key of the table is. And if there are any other constraints, we should go and do those as well. So let's add a primary key constraint here. So I can just go and say primary key for vendor ID. And if I run this again, okay, no, it's not an underscore. Okay, primary key, there we go, there we go. Okay, I'll run this again. I'll just clear the output out, run this again, and there we go. Okay, so it dropped the table and created it. So now when I look at vendors, so I've clicked on constraints, and we can see here that we have a constraint, which is the primary key. Now you'll also notice that there is a constraint name, SYSC007511. So this comes back to the lesson we did last class, that if you just declare what the constraint is, but you don't give it a name, the database is going to come up with a name for it. And that name isn't going to be the most useful name. If someone is using your database and they break one of these constraints, they're going to get a message that says, you just violated SYSC007511. So not very descriptive, right? So let's now improve this slightly, and we will now recreate our vendors table, but this time we're going to give the primary key a name. So I'm going to change this by using a slightly different syntax. So I use the constraint keyword, and now I'm going to put the name of the primary key. So I'm going to say vendors underscore PK, and then I say what the type of constraint is. It's a primary key. Okay, so I'll run this again. Okay, don't think that worked. Try this one more time. Okay, so let's see here. Constraints, vendors, PK. Okay, so I didn't have a semicolon there. It wasn't giving me much of an error. Okay, I'm not sure why I was getting an error there. All right, maybe I just didn't save it, I'm not sure. But, no, okay. Anyway, okay, it does appear to work, so sorry about the long, awkward pause. I'll try to edit that out. Let's go take a look now, though, at my vendors table. So if I refresh this, Okay, so now you'll notice that we have the actual constraint name of vendors_PK. So that's typically why it's important to name your constraints, so that you're going to get a more meaningful error message if someone makes a violation of the constraint. Okay, so we've done that for the primary key. Now vendor name, we're also going to have some constraints we're going to want to use for that. So one of the constraints we'll use will be, we'll make it not null, and we'll make it unique. Okay, so that makes sense, right? We're saying that for every vendor we enter, we have to give them a name, and the name has to be unique. We can't have two vendors with the exact same name. Okay, so we can obviously run this again, and this is going to clear out and recreate that table. And now when I double click on this table, if I go in and look at my constraints, I now see that I have these two new constraints. Of course, they have ugly names, so the next step would be to go and give them a proper name. So I'll go ahead and do that as well. Okay, so I'm going to say constraint, and I'm going to name this vendor name NN, so not null, and that constraint is not null. And then I'm also going to do another constraint, vendor name UN for unique. Okay, so let's run this again. All right, everything worked. And of course, if I went in, I'm not going to do it at this time, but if I went in, I would see that these names now show up for those constraints. Okay, so these are what are called column level constraints. And you have two options. You can do column constraints or you can do table constraints. Most of the time, it doesn't matter a lot. However, there are some situations where table level constraints are more powerful. So let's switch these up. Let's take the primary key, and instead of having it as a column constraint, let's set this constraint up now as a table level constraint. Okay, so all I have to do is basically at the end of my column declarations, I'm now going to place the constraint. So I'm going to write the constraint keyword, and I'm going to call this vendors underscore PK, and it's of type primary key. And now the only additional work I have to do is I have to actually specify what the column is. Where before I didn't have to type out the column because the constraint was obviously matched up with it. Now it's not. So SQL doesn't know where's the constraint, so I have to type it out. So I go vendor underscore ID, and that should be it. So now I can go ahead and I can run my script again. And there we go. It's created the table level constraint. Now, if it was a situation where, vendor ID obviously works well as a primary key. And if this was a big database and we went through and did our normalization, most likely you would expect vendor ID would be a primary key. But if it's possible, if you had a situation where you had a composite key, then I could say vendor name. Right? And I can rerun this, and there we go. Now, let's go in and take a look at the vendors table. And if I go constraints, so vendor primary key, and does it say, interesting. Okay, so it doesn't actually say what the columns are. I don't see that right here. Okay. All right. Well, it doesn't say what the what columns make up the key. I just figured they would. Okay, so let's close this. All right, so we've gone through an example there. If we wanted to create a composite key, we can easily do that here. Okay. All right, so let's do another example. Let's create another table here. So let's create a table called invoices. Now this is page 319 in the book. And let's see here. Okay, so invoices is gonna have an invoice ID, an invoice total, and a payment total. Okay, so I'll start writing this out. So create table, invoices. All right, so we'll type out what our columns are. Invoice ID, which is of type number. And then we have invoice total, which is also number, but we're going to use 9 digits and 2 digits to the right of the decimal. And the other column, payment total, is number as well. And once again, 9 digits and 2 digits to the right. Okay, so I can go ahead now. Let's just see if we can create this table. I'm gonna comment out this stuff here, and I'll also add in a drop table invoices. Okay, so let's run this. Okay, good. So this has been created. I'll refresh my tables. Okay, and there we go. I've got invoices right here. Okay, so once again, I don't have any constraints, and I'm going to want to use a few constraints. So let's see here. I'm going to want to go through and create some, I'll create column level constraints once again. So constraint invoices PK, and it's a primary key constraint, okay? And for invoice total, I'm going to have a constraint invoices total NN, and that's not null. And I'm also going to have a constraint, I'm also going to have a check constraint. So constraint check, and this is a check constraint, and this is a case where we want to make sure a check constraint is one where we want to make sure a value is within a certain range or fits a certain criteria. So I can then go invoice total is greater than or equal to 0. Okay, and moving on now, we just have the payment total one. So I want to do some constraints here. So for payment total, let's see here. I want to have a default value of 0. And I also want to have a check constraint. So I'm going to say default value of 0 and constraint payment total CK, and I'm going to check that the payment total is greater than or equal to 0. So it's essentially, I'm basically checking for invalid entries. If someone has a typo, we don't want them to be able to get away with accidentally entering a negative value or something invalid. So that's where a check constraint is really good. When you're designing a database and setting it up for someone, you want to use these type of constraints, all right? Kind of similar to when you're programming, there's something called an assertion. Use them, right? It's basically going to catch a condition where something bad is happening, and you're best off using a bunch of these because you don't want someone to accidentally be entering all kinds of bad info into your database. Okay, so we've got that. All right, so let's try running this. Okay, so that looks like it worked. So we've got those constraints. If I go to my invoices table and I go to constraints, I should see these now there. And I've got nice names, invoices PK, invoices total check, invoices total not null, and payment total not null. Okay, I just want to check again. I see the columns here. So if I go back to my vendors one, okay, so there it is. So what I was looking for before, where I made a composite key, when I select it, you can see that both of the columns are listed that form that primary key. Okay, so that's good, because I was looking at this for a while, like, where is it, right? But there it is. It has to be there. Okay. So let's go back. I'll close this out. And so we've done that. Now let's see here. We have a check constraint, but I've had to add two separate constraints. So another way I could do this is I could set up a table. This is another example where a table level constraint might be more powerful. So I'm going to remove these two separate check constraints. All right, and let's see here. So now I'm going to do a table level constraint, and I'm going to combine both of those check constraints into one table level constraint. So I'm going to write constraint invoices CK. So it's table level. I'm not going to name it based on an individual column anymore. And check is the type of constraint, and now I'm going to code my condition. So I'm going to say invoice underscore total is greater than or equal to 0, and payment underscore total is greater than or equal to 0. Okay, so that's an example there where it's a little bit nicer to use a table constraint, right? It makes it a little less typing, and it's a little bit more of a separation between my columns and this constraint. And I've combined that data, so I have one constraint. So let's just run this to make sure it works, and of course it does. All right, so I'm going to wrap it up. That's a pretty short video, and I have you guys again on Wednesday. So I'll be going through doing some more examples. I'd like to do some examples where we look at some foreign key, primary key relationships, and how those can be affected when you delete data and when you drop tables. So we'll look at that perhaps on Wednesday. Now I'm sure, hopefully you guys have all set up your databases. If you haven't and you're stuck, you can go back and look at my videos where I go through how I set mine up. But you really need to reach out and let me know, and I can provide you some assistance. The good thing is, if there was any issue, I mean, worst case is you just uninstall the software and you reinstall it. And we're using the Express edition of the Oracle database, and we're using the Oracle SQL developer. And these are fairly lightweight tools. So to just redo your installation isn't a whole lot of trouble for the most part. Okay, well, have a great day, and I'll talk to you guys later.